On Thursday afternoon, the sky above central South Carolina cracked open with a sound so loud that more than 1,400 people reported it to the federal government within hours. Homes bent sideways, airport hangars rattled. The United States Geological Survey logged it into the official earthquake catalogue under an event type it almost never uses. Sonic boom. NASA said it wasn't a meteor. The Air Force said it wasn't their fighters. The closest fighter wing said nothing at all. And then today, 48 hours later, 800 miles to the north, the sky cracked again, this time over Boston. People felt it from Cambridge out to Cape Cod. A satellite in geostationary orbit caught a flash over the Atlantic with no storm beneath it. Boston police dispatched units expecting an explosion and found nothing. 2 large, unexplained booms on the same coast in the same week, in front of the most advanced atmospheric monitoring network in human history. One of them got an answer in 90 minutes. The other one is still sitting in the federal catalogue with no source attached. And the strangest thing about the whole case is not the booms themselves. It is the question that the gap between those 2 answers is forcing the rest of us to ask. Hit the like button and subscribe to the Sky Lab if you have not already. Drop a comment telling me whether you heard either boom from where you are, and share this video so the rest of your people can catch up. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The boom above Boston. At a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Eastern Daylight Time on Saturday, May 30th, 2026, a single, dense, percussive sound travelled across eastern Massachusetts and shook the buildings beneath it. The first reports came from Cambridge, from Brighton, from Scituate, from Winchester, from Arlington, from Concord, from Linfield, from the North Shore, from Cape Cod. People felt it in homes 30 miles from each other. The Boston Police Department dispatched units to the Brighton neighbourhood because residents had called 911 to report what sounded like an explosion. Items fell off shelves. Doorbell cameras captured the audio signature of a sharp, low-frequency pressure wave arriving in a fraction of a second and then dissipating into a long, slow rumble. Within 10 minutes, the social channels of the greater Boston metropolitan area lit up with the same 3 words, repeated in 1,000 variations. What was that? It is the question this video is going to spend the next 2 hours trying to answer, and I want to tell you up front that we are not going to land it cleanly. The honest answer, the one that the data supports as of the moment I'm recording this, is that nobody yet knows for certain. There are leading hypotheses. There is a satellite-based detection that points hard in one direction. There is a piece of contradicting evidence from 2 days earlier that points hard in another direction. And there is a pattern, a temporal clustering, a coincidence of 2 events on the same coast in 48 hours that has the rest of the country sitting up and paying attention in a way that single isolated events rarely produce. The starting point is the geography. Eastern Massachusetts sits on the western edge of the North Atlantic, in a stretch of coastline that extends from the rocky beaches of the North Shore down through the Boston Harbor Islands, across the South Shore, and out into the long sandy arm of Cape Cod. The cities and towns of Greater Boston nest inside this geography like a constellation. Boston proper at the centre, Cambridge across the river to the northwest, the corridor cities of Lexington and Concord further out, the South Shore towns of Hingham and Cohasset and Scituate to the southeast, the Cape Ann towns to the northeast. When a pressure wave arrives over this kind of geography, the way the felt reports come in tells you something about the source. A pressure wave that produces a tight footprint, with most of the reports clustered within a few miles of a single point, is consistent with a small, ground-level event. A pressure wave that produces a broad footprint, with reports scattered across 40 or 50 or 80 miles in multiple directions, is consistent with something happening high up in the atmosphere, with the pressure radiating outward from an elevated source point that has line of sight to a wide swath of the surface. The pattern of the reports today fit the second profile. They came in from communities scattered along a roughly 30 to 50 mile radius, around the Boston metropolitan core, with the densest cluster in the immediate Cambridge to Brighton to Boston corridor, and with secondary clusters out along the North Shore and inland toward Worcester County. That kind of footprint, in the language of atmospheric acoustics, is consistent with an aerial source. Something happened in the air, not the ground. Boston police, when they responded to the calls in Brighton, did not find an explosion. There was no fire, there was no damaged structure, there was no debris field, There was a neighbourhood full of confused residents and a sky that, by every visual indication, looked entirely ordinary. Clear conditions, no thunderstorm anywhere within 100 miles of the Boston metropolitan area, no smoke, no visible contrail in the direction the pressure waves seemed to be coming from, just the sound and the shaking and the dispatch logs and the rapidly growing list of communities reporting the same event. The first attempt at an explanation came from a man named Eric Fisher. Fisher is the chief meteorologist at WBZ, the CBS affiliate in Boston, and he is among the most followed regional meteorologists in New England. Within approximately 90 minutes of the boom, Fisher posted publicly that he had checked the United States Geological Survey earthquake feed and found no earthquake associated with the event. He suggested, in that initial post, that the source might be a meteor. The post hit social media at about 3:30 in the afternoon. By 4:30, Fisher had posted a follow-up. He had now confirmed, in his professional opinion, that the source of the boom was indeed a meteor. Definitely a meteor causing that big boom, were his exact words. The professional consensus among East Coast meteorologists watching the event in real time converged on the same conclusion within the next hour. Nick Stewart, who is a spaceflight meteorologist who covers launches and atmospheric meteor events on a professional basis, posted that the boom was, in his characterization, going to be a rather significant bolide/meteor entering the atmosphere. Stewart cited as the basis for this attribution a single piece of evidence. The geostationary lightning mapper instrument aboard the Goose 19 satellite, the newest of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's geostationary weather satellites, had registered a flash detection over the Atlantic east of the Massachusetts coastline within minutes of the boom. The flash did not correlate with any active thunderstorm. The skies above eastern Massachusetts were largely clear at the time. The signature, in Stewart's reading, and in the reading that propagated quickly across the regional meteorological community, was consistent with a bolide. A bolide is the technical term for an exceptionally bright meteor that explodes in the atmosphere as it heats up during entry. When a bolide is large enough and the atmospheric path is steep enough, the energy released in the breakup can produce a pressure wave that propagates outward in all directions. When that pressure wave reaches the surface, it sounds like a sonic boom, because in a meaningful technical sense, that is what it is. This is the leading hypothesis for the Massachusetts event at the moment I am recording this. A bolide entered the atmosphere over the western North Atlantic, broke apart somewhere in the upper troposphere east of the Massachusetts coast, and produced a pressure wave that propagated westward and inland, reaching the greater Boston metropolitan area within seconds of the breakup event. The geostationary lightning mapper saw the flash. The American Meteor Society's public fireball reporting queue began collecting eyewitness submissions from residents across the region in the hours following the event. The professional meteorological community had a coherent attribution within 90 minutes, and the immediate question shifted from what was that to where exactly did it come down, and how big was the source object. But I want to stop here, because there is a piece of this story that does not fit cleanly into the bolide narrative, and it is the piece that turns this from an interesting one-off event into something that has the rest of the country watching the eastern seaboard with a particular intensity right now. 2 days earlier, on Thursday, May 28th, 2026, at 24 minutes past 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Eastern Daylight Time, an almost identical event occurred 800 miles to the south, over the Midlands of South Carolina. It rattled buildings across more than 100 miles of geography. It produced 1,454 felt responses on the federal Did You Feel It survey system. It generated at the United States Geological Survey a catalogue entry with a unique event identifier, and the federal agencies that should have been able to attribute it between them ruled out every conventional source without ruling in any specific alternative. The South Carolina event is still officially unexplained. The federal earthquake catalogue records it as a sonic boom event type, with magnitude 0.0 and depth 0 kilometers, 6 kilometers north-northeast of a town called St. Andrews. The catalogue page does not say what made the boom. It only says what the boom was not. It was not an earthquake. NASA said it was not a meteor. The Air Force said it was not a Shaw Air Force Base F-16. The agency closest to the catalogued point, McEntire Joint National Guard Base, did not say anything. And then, 48 hours later, on a different state, on the same coast, on the same week, the sky cracked again over Boston. The question this video is built around, the question that runs through every part from here to the end is the following. If the federal infrastructure can attribute one of these two booms within 90 minutes and cannot attribute the other one within 48 hours, what is the structural difference between the two events that produces the difference in disclosure? And is the difference in disclosure telling us something about the two events themselves, or is it telling us something about the system that does the attributing? The answer matters. It matters for what we should think about today's event over Boston, and it matters for what we should expect the next entry in the catalogue to tell us when it comes. Part 2. What goes? 19 saw. The thing I want to do before we go back to the South Carolina event is to look hard at the satellite that produced the public Meteor attribution for today's Boston boom, because the speed at which a single satellite-based observation converted public ambiguity into a confident attribution is, in itself, one of the more interesting facts in this case. And understanding what the instrument can and cannot detect is the first step toward understanding why one of these two booms got an answer and the other one is still waiting. The satellite is called GOES-19. The letters stand for Geostationary Operational Environmental Satellite. The number 19 refers to its position in the lineage of geostationary weather satellites that the United States has operated since the 1970s. GOES-19 is the newest of the series, having reached operational status in 2025. It sits at a geosynchronous orbit approximately 22,236 miles above the equator, in a position that gives it a continuous view of the Western Hemisphere from a fixed perspective. Its instruments are looking down at the same patch of Earth, the same continents, the same oceans every second of every day. The satellite is the backbone of operational weather forecasting for North and South America. The instrument that recorded the flash today is called the Geostationary Lightning Mapper, abbreviated as GLM. The mapper was first flown on GOES-16, which became operational in 2017, and it has been a standard payload on every GOES satellite since. The mapper does exactly what its name suggests. It maps lightning. It does this by taking very high-speed images of the entire visible hemisphere and looking for sudden, brief flashes of light against the background of the planet. The technical specifications are worth understanding because they matter for what the instrument can and cannot detect. The Geostationary Lightning Mapper takes approximately 500 images of Earth every second. Each frame is processed by an onboard computer that looks for brightness anomalies. When the computer sees a sudden increase in brightness in a specific pixel that lasts for a small number of frames and then fades, it records the event as a lightning flash, with a timestamp accurate to within a millisecond and a location accurate to within a few kilometers. Over the course of a single thunderstorm, the mapper might record thousands of these flashes, building up a real-time map of where the lightning is and how the storm is intensifying. But the mapper is calibrated for brightness sensitivity in a way that, by design, also makes it sensitive to other transient bright events that happen in the atmosphere. The most important of these for our purposes are bolides. When a bolide enters the upper atmosphere, the friction between the entering object and the air heats the object to incandescence. If the object is large enough, the heating cascades into a rapid disintegration, in which the entering body fragments into smaller pieces over the course of a few seconds. During the fragmentation, the object releases its kinetic energy as electromagnetic radiation, primarily as visible light. From the perspective of a satellite in geostationary orbit looking down at the atmosphere, a bolide breakup event looks like a sudden, brief, very bright flash, lasting between a few hundred milliseconds and a few full seconds, with no associated storm structure beneath it. This is exactly the signature the Geostationary Lightning Mapper is calibrated to detect. And in fact, the instrument has been formally credited with multiple bolide detections in the years since it became operational. The most well-documented recent example before today was a bolide that entered the atmosphere over Lake Erie in northern Ohio on a Sunday afternoon in March 2026. The Cooperative Institute for Meteorological Satellite Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison published a detailed technical analysis of that event, walking through the satellite frame by frame and showing the flash signature against the cloud-free background of the lake. That analysis is in the public record. It establishes, in technical terms that have been peer-reviewed within the satellite remote sensing community, that the Geostationary Lightning Mapper aboard the GOES series satellites can and does see bolides. So when, this afternoon, the mapper registered a flash over the Atlantic east of the Massachusetts coastline, with no thunderstorm beneath it, and approximately coincident in time with the Boston boom, the regional meteorological community immediately reached for the bolide explanation. It is the parsimonious explanation. It fits the signature. It fits the instrument's documented capability. It fits the prior precedent. And it explains the felt footprint of the Boston boom in a way that other hypotheses do not. But I want to be honest about the limits of what this single piece of evidence actually tells us. The geostationary lightning mapper is, like every space-based instrument, not infallible. The technical literature on the mapper documents several categories of false positive detection that have to be filtered out before any given flash is treated as a confirmed atmospheric event. The first category is reflections from cloud tops. When sunlight bounces off the upper surface of a tall cumulus cloud at the right angle, the resulting glint can be bright enough to register as a transient event in the mapper's processing. The second category is solar glints off bodies of water. The same physics applies. When the sun is at the right angle relative to a flat body of water, the reflected light can produce a brief brightness spike that looks like an atmospheric event from orbit. The third category is electromagnetic interference, in which the mapper's electronics register a signal from a non-optical source and process it as if it were a brightness change. For each of these false positive categories, the mapper's onboard processing has filtering algorithms designed to suppress them. But the algorithms are not perfect. Every year, a small number of detections turn out, on follow-up analysis, to be reflections or glints or interference rather than genuine atmospheric events. The standard practice in the remote sensing community is to treat any individual mapper detection as a candidate event, not a confirmed event, until it has been corroborated by independent observations from other instruments, by ground-based eyewitness accounts, or by the recovery of meteoritic debris. The processing pipeline that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration uses for the geostationary lightning mapper data product runs the raw detections through several stages of automated filtering before any individual event is flagged for public reporting. The first stage filters out detections that occur in pixels with persistent thermal anomalies, which are typically associated with surface features rather than transient atmospheric events. The second stage filters out detections that do not exhibit the characteristic light curve shape of an atmospheric flash, with a sharp rise time on the order of tens of milliseconds and a slower decay over a few hundred milliseconds. The third stage cross-checks the detection against the ground-based lightning detection networks operated by the National Lightning Detection Network and by the Earth Network's Total Lightning Network, with detections that do not correlate with either network being flagged as candidates for non-lightning atmospheric events. The fourth stage cross checks the detection against the weather radar product to determine whether the event occurred within the footprint of an active thunderstorm. Detections that pass all four filters and that occur outside the footprint of an active storm are flagged for human analyst review, and it is at this stage that the candidate bolide events typically emerge. Today's Boston event has had, within the first few hours after the boom, a rapidly growing body of public eyewitness submissions to the American Meteor Society's pending Fireball Reports queue. That queue is the standard public archive of eyewitness sightings, where members of the public submit a structured report describing what they saw, where they were, and in what direction the object was travelling. The Society processes these submissions, cross-references them against each other, and assigns a unique event identifier to fireballs that have enough corroborating witnesses to constitute a confirmed event. The Boston event submissions, at the time I'm recording this, had not yet been consolidated into an official event entry. That process typically takes between a few hours and a day or two, depending on the volume of submissions and the consistency of the witness reports. If the American Meteor Society process resolves the Boston event into a confirmed fireball, with an assigned event identifier and a reconstructed trajectory, then the bolide hypothesis is locked in. The satellite flash, the lack of thunderstorm correlation, the meteorological community attribution, and the corroborated eyewitness trajectory will, together, constitute the kind of evidence chain that turns a public mystery into a closed case in the official record. But if the American Meteor Society process does not resolve, if the witness reports are too sparse or too inconsistent, or if they conflict with the satellite flash location, then the bolide hypothesis remains a hypothesis. The flash by itself does not establish the source. It only establishes that the mapper registered something. The witnesses by themselves do not establish the source either. They only establish that the public saw something. And as we're about to see, the South Carolina event from 2 days ago shows what happens when the evidence chain does not converge cleanly. It shows what happens when the satellites do not register a flash, when the witnesses do not consistently see a meteor, when the conventional sources get publicly ruled out one by one, and when the catalogue entry sits open in the federal record with the event type designation, but no source attribution. That is the second event, and it is the event that is forcing the rest of us to take today's Boston event more seriously than we would if it had happened in isolation. Part 3. The South Carolina Boom, 2 days earlier. The day was Thursday, May 28th, 2026. The time was 24 minutes and 30 seconds past 9 o'clock in the evening, Coordinated Universal Time, which in Eastern Daylight Time, where the event occurred, was 24 minutes and 30 seconds past 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The location was a point 6 kilometers northeast of a small unincorporated community called St. Andrews, situated in Richland County, South Carolina, immediately to the northwest of the city of Columbia, the state capital. The catalogued source point falls in the vicinity of South Carolina State Highway 215 and a training facility called the South Carolina Fire Academy. For people in the Midlands of South Carolina that evening, the experience of the boom was, by every account, unforgettable. A meteorologist named Chris Jackson was in South Carolina at the time. He described it publicly within hours of the event as feeling like someone had shoved him right in the chest an instant before the boom began. A resident of Rember, South Carolina, located approximately 30 miles east of Columbia, reported that their home bent to the east and then righted itself. They characterized the experience as an airburst. Video captured at an airport in the area showed the metal walls of an airport hangar physically rattling in response to the pressure wave. Doorbell cameras across residential neighborhoods captured both the audible boom and the brief tremor it imparted to building structures. The geographic distribution of the felt reports was wider than the Massachusetts event today. Reports came in from the entire Midlands region, from Columbia north toward Charlotte, from Columbia east to Florence, and toward Darlington County, from Columbia south toward the Aiken area and the Georgia border. Submissions to the federal Did You Feel It system arrived from communities as far away as Chesterfield County, well outside what would normally be considered the viewing area for a single atmospheric event over Columbia. By the end of the first 24 hours, the federal system had collected 1,454 felt response submissions, plotted across 120 intensity blocks on the federal map, with a maximum reported intensity of 6 on the modified Macaulay scale. I want to pause on that number because it matters. The modified Macaulay scale is the standard way the United States Geological Survey characterizes the felt intensity of a seismic event. It runs from 1, which is imperceptible to humans and only registers on instruments, up to 12, which is total destruction. Intensity 6 on the scale is characterized as strong shaking, the level at which buildings begin to sustain minor structural damage. Plaster cracks, furniture moves, items fall from shelves. People who are standing have difficulty maintaining their balance. The fact that the May 28th event produced intensity 6 reports, plural, across a footprint of more than 100 miles, means that whatever produced this pressure wave was not a trivial atmospheric event. It was an event with enough energy at the source to do real, distributed shaking across thousands of square miles of land. The United States Geological Survey responded within hours. The agency confirmed publicly that the event was not an earthquake. They did this for the same reason a doctor sometimes tells you what an illness is not before they tell you what it is. They wanted to take a category off the table. The seismic waveform analysis did not show the signature of an earthquake, which is to say it did not show the kind of pressure wave that comes from the elastic release of subsurface strain at a fault interface. Instead, the waveform looked like a pressure wave that had arrived at the surface from above. The signature was consistent with what is called a sonic boom, an acoustic shock wave produced by something moving through the atmosphere at supersonic speed, with the shock front breaking against the ground from the air above rather than emerging from the rock below. The agency assigned the event a unique catalogue identifier. It begins with the letters US, which is the standard United States network prefix in the Federal Earthquake Catalogue. The full identifier is US 7000 SP6M. The event was given a magnitude designation of 0.0 because the magnitude scales used in seismology are calibrated for earthquakes, for the elastic release of subsurface strain, and they do not produce a meaningful number when applied to atmospheric pressure events. The depth was assigned a value of 0 kilometers because the source of the pressure wave was in the air above the surface, not in the rock below it. And the event type field on the catalogue page, the field that on every earthquake entry in the catalogue reads either earthquake or quarry blast, or some other standard descriptor, on this entry reads sonic boom. Sonic boom, as an event type. In the official Federal Earthquake Catalogue of the United States, this is the part that, when you start digging into it, becomes the thing that pulls you back to the catalogue page over and over again. The sonic boom event type designation is not a category the Federal Earthquake Catalogue uses casually. The overwhelming majority of public boom reports that arrive at the United States Geological Survey are filed in the Did You Feel It system and assessed for seismic correlation, and most of them resolve into either small earthquakes, sensor artifacts, or nuisance reports that never produce a unique catalogue identifier. The decision to log an event into the public catalogue with a unique identifier and an explicit sonic boom designation indicates that the agency considered the event to be of sufficient public significance, of sufficient analytical clarity, and of sufficient certainty about its non-earthquake origin to warrant a permanent entry in the official record. It is the kind of catalogue action that says, in the formal language of the agency, this happened, and we are recording it, and we are confident enough about what it was not to give it a name. But the name the agency gave it does not include a source. Sonic boom describes the physics of the event. It does not describe the cause. A sonic boom is what happens when something moves through the atmosphere faster than the speed of sound. The catalogue tells us what kind of pressure wave arrived. It does not tell us what was moving fast enough to produce it. And this is where the federal disclosure pattern becomes the most interesting fact in the case. Because 3 separate federal agencies, each with a different chain of authority and a different operational mandate, took different public positions on the question of what was moving through the airspace over central South Carolina at 24 minutes past 5 on the afternoon of May 28th. The first was the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA confirmed, on the record, that there was no fireball detected by any of its space-based or ground-based observational assets during the relevant time window. This is a statement with weight, because NASA's detection chain for atmospheric meteor events includes both the geostationary lightning mapper instruments aboard the Goose series satellites, the same instruments that registered the flash over the Atlantic east of Massachusetts today, and the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies Fireball Detection Network, which routinely logs even modest atmospheric meteor entries from around the world. If a bolide had entered the atmosphere over central South Carolina with enough energy to produce a 100-mile felt footprint and an intensity 6 pressure wave, the chances that none of NASA's detection assets would have registered it are, by the agency's own statements about its detection capabilities, very low. NASA's negative finding is, in the technical sense, evidence. It is evidence against the Meteor hypothesis for the May 28th South Carolina event. The second federal entity that responded was Shaw Air Force Base. Shaw is located in Sumter, South Carolina, approximately 40 kilometers east-southeast of the St. Andrews Catalogue Point. The base is the home of the 20th Fighter Wing of the United States Air Force, which operates F-16 Fighting Falcon aircraft. The F-16 is supersonic capable. Under operational conditions, it can fly faster than the speed of sound, and when it does, it produces a sonic boom. Shaw confirmed on the record that none of its based aircraft were operating in supersonic flight conditions during the time window of the boom. The base did not say, and was not asked to say, what other aircraft might or might not have been transiting the airspace within their operational area. They only said that none of theirs were doing it. The third federal entity that should have been able to address the question was McEntire Joint National Guard Base. McEntire is located in Eastover, South Carolina, approximately 30 kilometers east of the St. Andrews Catalogue Point. It is the home of the 169th Fighter Wing of the South Carolina Air National Guard, which operates F-16 Fighting Falcon Block 52 aircraft. These are advanced variants of the F-16 platform, optimized for the modern fighter mission set, including air-to-air combat, suppression of enemy air defenses and precision ground attack. They are, like all F-16s, supersonic capable, and they are based 30 kilometers from the catalogue source point of the May 28th boom. In the days following the event, McEntire did not issue a public statement. They did not confirm that their aircraft were operating in supersonic flight conditions during the event window. They did not deny it. They did not provide a public characterization of their flight operations on the afternoon of May 28th at all. The silence of McIntyre, in the context of NASA's public negative finding and Shaw's public negative finding, became its own data point. And I want to dwell here for a moment because the geography of where the boom landed matters as much as the geography of where the airframes are based. The catalogued source point at 6 kilometres north-northeast of St Andrews places the event over a particular kind of terrain. To the immediate east of St Andrews lies Lake Murray itself, a reservoir constructed during the 1920s by the impoundment of the Saluda River. The reservoir is approximately 40 miles long and covers about 50,000 acres of surface water. In the middle of the reservoir sits a small landmass called Doolittle Island, which during the Second World War was used by the United States Army Air Forces as a practice bombing range for B-25 Mitchell bombers, preparing for the famous Doolittle raid on Tokyo in 1942. The island is still called, on every local map and in every conversation among lifelong Lake Murray residents, Bomb Island. The name is not a coincidence. The history of military aviation training over this specific patch of South Carolina geography is older than the modern Air Force itself, and the airspace has been part of the operational fabric of national defense aviation for more than 80 years. The boom occurred above this corridor. It occurred above a reservoir that is, by historical practice, an established military overflight area. It occurred above an active earthquake swarm corridor that has been producing record-breaking shallow seismicity for over 4 years. It occurred above the geographic footprint of the Eastern Piedmont Fault System, a structure that has been geologically quiet for hundreds of millions of years until December of 2021, and it occurred at 24 minutes past 5 on a Thursday afternoon, on a calendar day that fell 2 days before Memorial Day, when both regular Air Force and Air National Guard units across the eastern United States are typically operating at elevated training tempos in preparation for holiday weekend ceremonial duties. The combination of factors, taken together, does not point to any single explanation, but the combination of factors does mean that the May 28th boom occurred in a geographic and operational context where multiple candidate sources are simultaneously plausible. I want to be careful with this, because the silence of a federal entity is not, in any formal sense, an admission. There are many reasons a base might not issue a public statement about its operational schedule. The standard practice for both regular Air Force and Air National Guard installations is that flight operations within authorized airspace are not subject to public disclosure. That supersonic flight in particular is regulated by Federal Aviation Administration rules that govern altitude and corridor restrictions, but do not require public notification of every supersonic event, and that the standard public affairs response to a media inquiry about specific flight schedules on a specific date is typically a courteous redirect to the appropriate Department of Defense channel. The absence of a public statement in this context is consistent with both a routine non-disclosure of operational details and with a deliberate decision to neither confirm nor deny. The available evidence does not distinguish between these two readings, but the fact of the silence, set against the active public engagement of NASA and Shaw, is the kind of asymmetry that the rest of us are forced to notice. So here is where we are, at the end of the South Carolina event's first 48 hours. A pressure wave hit the Midlands. It produced a 100-mile felt footprint and a maximum intensity of 6 on the modified Mercalli scale. The Federal Earthquake Catalogue recorded it as a sonic boom event type. NASA said it was not a meteor. Shaw said it was not their aircraft. McIntyre said nothing. And then 48 hours later, the sky cracked open over Boston, and the same federal infrastructure was suddenly able to converge on an attribution within 90 minutes. The asymmetry is the story. Part 4. The three agencies, NASA, Shaw, and the silence of McIntyre. If the federal infrastructure for attributing atmospheric pressure events were a single, unified system, with a single agency responsible for all sources and a single decision tree for assigning attribution, then today's Boston event and Thursday's South Carolina event should produce the same kind of resolution at the same speed. They have not, and the reason they have not is that the federal infrastructure is not a single system. It is a layered set of agencies, each with a specific operational mandate, each with its own public affairs posture, each authorized to speak only to the slice of the question that falls within its authority. Understanding which agency is authorized to speak to which slice of the question is the first step in understanding what the asymmetry of disclosure between Massachusetts and South Carolina actually tells us. NASA's mandate, in the context of atmospheric pressure events, is to detect and characterize objects entering the atmosphere from space. The agency operates the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies, which maintains the public Fireball and Bolide database. It manages the geostationary Lightning Mapper data product alongside the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It maintains a network of ground-based observatories and contributes to the international planetary defense data sharing infrastructure. When a meteor enters the atmosphere with enough energy to register on multiple detection assets, NASA is the agency authorized to characterize it. When the agency says, on the record, that no fireball was detected, the statement is grounded in the agency's instrument network. The negative finding is a positive output of the detection system, in the same way that a clean medical test result is a positive output of a diagnostic system. It is not the same as saying nothing happened. It is saying that, by the standards of the agency's detection chain, no meteor was observed. Shaw Air Force Base's mandate, in the context of atmospheric pressure events, is more narrow. The base is operationally responsible for the activities of its assigned aircraft. The 20th Fighter Wing's F-16s fly under operational tasking from United States Air Forces in Europe, Air Forces Africa, and from the Air Combat Command, depending on the mission. When the base says, on the record, that none of its aircraft were operating in supersonic flight during a specific window, it is making a statement about its own flight logs. It is not making a statement about every aircraft in the airspace over central South Carolina. There could be other Air Force aircraft transiting the area, on operational orders from other commands, that Shaw would not necessarily have visibility into. There could be civilian supersonic test aircraft. There could be foreign military aircraft on training exercises in international airspace, transiting back through United States airspace under standard transit clearances. Shaw's negative finding addresses the most likely conventional source for a sonic boom in the area, which is the F-16s based at Shaw itself. But it does not exhaust the conventional sources. McEntire Joint National Guard Base sits in a different category from both NASA and Shaw. It is an Air National Guard installation, operating under a hybrid chain of command that includes both state authority, through the Governor of South Carolina, and federal authority through the National Guard Bureau and the United States Air Force. The 169th Fighter Wing is a federally recognized Air National Guard unit, but its operational tasking can come from either the state level or the federal level depending on the mission. The Public Affairs Office at McEntire is structurally similar to public affairs offices at regular Air Force bases, but the disclosure norms are slightly different. Air National Guard units typically do not publicly characterize their training flight operations in real time. Routine training flights, including supersonic training flights conducted within authorized airspace and altitude restrictions, are not subject to public notification under standard practice. So if you ask me to look at the silence of McEntire, in isolation from everything else, the most defensible reading is that the base simply has no public affairs mandate to comment on its operational schedule for any given afternoon, and that the absence of a statement reflects the routine practice of an Air National Guard installation, rather than the deliberate withholding of information about a specific event. That reading is consistent with everything we know about how Air National Guard public affairs typically operates. It is the boring reading. It is probably the correct reading. But I want to be honest about why the silence has, over the past 48 hours, generated as much speculation as it has. The reason is that the federal disclosure pattern, taken in its totality, is structured in a way that draws attention to the silence. NASA chose to make a public negative finding. Shaw chose to make a public negative finding. The United States Geological Survey chose to log the event into the catalogue with a sonic boom designation. Each of these public actions, in its own way, tightened the focus on the question of what produced the boom. And as the conventional sources got ruled out one by one, the agencies that did not speak publicly became, by a kind of negative inference, the agencies whose airspace was now under attention. This is not a fair inferential structure. The silence of an agency that has no public affairs mandate to comment is not, in any formal sense, an admission. But the human mind and the social media discourse environment do not always operate on formal inferential structures. They operate on patterns of attention. And the pattern of attention here, with the loudest public agencies making the most specific public denials, and the most operationally proximate agency saying nothing at all, has produced a focal asymmetry that the data alone does not justify, but that the disclosure structure has nonetheless created. And the asymmetry has gotten sharper today, because the Massachusetts event has been attributed with such speed and confidence by the same federal infrastructure that, just 2 days ago, was leaving the South Carolina event open. The structural difference between the two attribution patterns is what makes the case worth examining. In the Massachusetts case, the geostationary lightning mapper produced a satellite-based detection within minutes. The detection was specific in location, specific in time, and specific in signature. It generated a piece of evidence that the regional meteorological community could point to publicly, that they could explain in terms of an instrument with documented prior capability to detect bolides, and that fit the felt footprint of the event in a physically coherent way. The professional consensus formed in 90 minutes because the evidence was good enough to support a confident attribution. The system worked. In the South Carolina case, the geostationary lightning mapper did not produce a detection. NASA confirmed this publicly. Whatever produced the May 28th boom did not produce a flash signature on the same satellite that 2 days later would catch the Massachusetts event so cleanly. The absence of a satellite detection is itself a piece of evidence. It tells us that whatever happened over central South Carolina did not produce the visual and electromagnetic signature that a bolide would produce. The candidate sources that remain after a missing satellite detection are different from the candidate sources that the satellite detection would support. This is the structural difference. The Massachusetts boom produced satellite evidence, the South Carolina boom did not, and the speed of attribution scales with the strength of the evidence. The system can attribute quickly when the evidence is good. It cannot attribute quickly when the evidence is missing or contradictory. The interesting question, then, is not why one was attributed quickly and the other was not. That part is structurally explained by the evidence. The interesting question is what kind of source produces a 100-mile felt footprint and an intensity 6 pressure wave without producing a satellite-detectable flash. And as we're about to see in the next part, the answers to that question are not many, and they are not entirely comfortable. Part 5. The bolide case. I want to spend this part walking through the bolide hypothesis carefully, because it is the leading attribution for today's Massachusetts event, and because understanding what it does and does not explain is essential for understanding the limits of the parallel case for the South Carolina event. A bolide, as I described earlier, is an exceptionally bright meteor that breaks up in the atmosphere as it heats up during entry. The size threshold above which we typically use the term bolide rather than just meteor is not formally defined, but in practice the term is reserved for objects whose entry produces a flash visible to the naked eye, often during daylight, and whose energy release is sufficient to be detected by satellite-based instruments. The Center for Near-Earth Object Studies, in its public Fireball database, logs bolide events with energies typically ranging from a few hundredths of a kiloton to several kilotons of equivalent yield. Larger events are rare but not unheard of. The Chelyabinsk meteor in February 2013, which entered the atmosphere over the Russian Federation and produced a shock wave that blew out windows across several towns, was an estimated 440 kiloton event. The Tunguska event in 1908, which flattened a substantial area of Siberian forest, is estimated at 3 to 15 megatons of equivalent yield. The Massachusetts event today, based on the felt footprint and the intensity of the reports, is consistent with a bolide in the range of perhaps a few tens of tons of mass and an energy release in the small fraction of a kiloton range. This is enough to produce a clearly audible boom over a 100-mile radius, and enough to produce structural shaking strong enough to dispatch police units. It is not, by orders of magnitude, in the range of an event that would produce catastrophic damage. It is in the range of events that the geostationary lightning mapper has been documented to detect routinely. The signature of a bolide entry, from the perspective of the surface, follows a typical pattern. The entry begins with a flash of light, sometimes visible during daylight as a brief, intensely bright object moving across the sky. The flash is followed, after a delay that depends on the height of the entry and the speed of sound at the entry altitude, by an acoustic shock wave that arrives at the surface and propagates outward. The delay between the visual flash and the audible boom is what gives a bolide entry its characteristic signature on the surface. People who see the flash often report the sound arriving 30 seconds, sometimes a minute or more after the visual event. The delay is consistent with the speed of sound and the height of the breakup, which is typically in the range of 20 to 40 kilometers above the surface. For today's Massachusetts event, the felt reports include both visual sightings, as logged in the American Meteor Society pending fireball reports queue, and the audible boom that propagated across the metropolitan area. The geostationary lightning mapper flash detection over the Atlantic east of the Massachusetts coastline is consistent with a breakup point offshore, with the pressure wave propagating westward over the water and reaching the populated areas of eastern Massachusetts as it arrived at the coast. The geometry fits. The signature fits. The instrument that registered the flash has documented prior bolide detection capability. The professional meteorological community converged on the attribution within 90 minutes because the evidence is, in the technical sense, sufficient for a high-confidence attribution. I want to flag, however, that there is a piece of the bolide hypothesis for the Massachusetts event that remains incomplete. As of the time I'm recording this, no large fragments have been recovered. No ground-based impact site has been identified. The atmospheric breakup may have been complete enough that no significant fragments survived to the surface, which is the typical outcome for entries of this size. But the absence of recovered material is, in any bolide hypothesis, a piece of evidence that has to be acknowledged. The full evidence chain for the Massachusetts event will be locked in only when either ground-based fragments are recovered, or when the American Meteor Society finalizes the witness-based trajectory reconstruction, and the trajectory is consistent with the location of the satellite flash detection. Now, I want to apply the same bolide analytic framework to the South Carolina event from 2 days ago, because the comparison is what tells us why the South Carolina event remains open in the catalogue. For the South Carolina event, NASA confirmed on the record that no fireball was detected by any of its observational assets during the relevant window. This means that whatever happened over central South Carolina did not produce a flash detectable by the geostationary lightning mapper, did not produce an entry visible to ground-based all-sky cameras in the region, and did not produce a thermal signature visible to any of the other detection systems NASA maintains. The negative finding is, in the technical sense, evidence against the bolide hypothesis for the May 28th event. There was a single eyewitness account from Columbia, South Carolina, in which a resident posted publicly that they observed some odd contrails immediately following the boom, radiating from a common point in a pattern that they characterized as consistent with a meteor explosion. A separate doorbell camera frame appeared to show a contrail-like trail in the upper right of the captured image. These are not negligible observations. They're also not, in the totality of the available evidence, sufficient to override the NASA negative finding. One eyewitness contrail observation and one doorbell camera frame are evidence that something happened in the sky, but they are not evidence that what happened was a bolide of the type that the geostationary lightning mapper would normally detect. The most defensible technical reading of the South Carolina event is that whatever produced the boom did not have the visual and electromagnetic signature of a bolide of the energy class needed to produce the observed felt footprint. The signature was missing. The flash was missing. The standard satellite-based evidence that would have closed the case quickly was not there. This is what makes the South Carolina event different from the Massachusetts event in the formal sense. The Massachusetts event has the signature. The South Carolina event does not. And when the signature is missing, the catalogue entry stays open, because the system cannot attribute without the evidence. Which brings us to the question of what kind of source could produce the South Carolina event without producing the bolide signature, and the answers, as we are about to see, are not many. Part 6. The Lake Murray Swarm. There is a piece of the South Carolina story that I have been deliberately holding back, because it is the kind of detail that, when you first encounter it, sounds like a coincidence too neat to be real. Once you know it, the entire May 28th event takes on a different shape. The catalogue point of the boom, the location designated as 6 kilometers north-northeast of St. Andrews, sits inside the active footprint of an ongoing earthquake swarm. The swarm is centered near Lake Murray, a large reservoir located approximately 10 miles west of the catalogue's source point. The swarm began producing measurable seismicity in February of 2026, less than 4 months before the boom. It has continued at a rate of multiple felt events per month through the spring. The largest events have reached the high magnitude 2 range, with isolated events approaching the lower magnitude 3 range. the cumulative felt response volume across all events in the swarm since February has exceeded several thousand submissions to the federal Did You Feel It system. This is, in the language of intraplate seismology, an active swarm. But the Lake Murray swarm is not the only active swarm in the area. About 20 miles further north and east, near the town of Elgin, a separate swarm has been producing measurable seismicity since late 2021. The Elgin swarm has now been active for over 4.5 years. It has produced hundreds of catalogued events, some of which have been felt across the Midlands of South Carolina and as far away as the Charlotte metropolitan area in North Carolina. The rate of seismicity in the broader Midlands region since the Elgin swarm began is, by the United States Geological Survey's own assessment, the highest measured in the historical instrumental record for the region. What makes this remarkable is the geological setting. South Carolina is, by every standard structural classification, an intraplate region. It sits in the interior of the North American tectonic plate, hundreds of miles from the nearest active plate boundary. The nearest analogous setting where you would expect to see active seismicity is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the seafloor spreading centre where the North American and African plates are actively pulling apart, but that is more than 2,000 miles offshore. The interior of the eastern United States has not been a tectonically active region in the conventional sense for hundreds of millions of years. The mountain-building event that constructed the Proto-Appalachian Range, which geologists call the Appalachian orogeny, occurred during the late Paleozoic, approximately 300 million years ago. The structures created during that event have been quiet at the surface ever since. And yet, in the Midlands of South Carolina, those ancient structures are now producing measurable seismicity at the highest rates ever instrumentally recorded for the region. The faults along which the Lake Murray and Elgin swarms are occurring are, by the United States Geological Survey's structural interpretation, strands of what is called the Eastern Piedmont Fault System. This system is a zone of geologic weakness that runs northeast to southwest from Virginia, through the Carolinas, into Georgia, marking the boundary between the metamorphic rocks of the Piedmont province and the sedimentary rocks of the coastal plain. The system is the structural memory of the Appalachian orogeny. It has been there for 300 million years, and until December of 2021, it had been geologically quiet at the surface for the entirety of recorded human history. The Washington Post and the Boston Globe published feature reporting on the broader pattern in March of 2026. The Post and Courier published a detailed explainer characterizing the swarms as the reactivation of fault systems that had been seismically quiet for hundreds of millions of years. The reactivation is unusual. It is not unprecedented in the global record. Other ancient intraplate systems have reactivated under modern stress conditions in other parts of the world, but the rate at which it is happening in South Carolina, and the fact that it has now been sustained for over 4.5 years, has the structural geology community paying close attention. So here is the geographic fact that the May 28th event introduces into the discussion. The catalogue point of the boom is located directly above an active strand of a fault system that has been producing record-breaking shallow seismicity for years. The boom occurred at 0 kilometers depth, meaning the acoustic shock wave reached the surface from above, and the fault system below produces its earthquakes at depths typically in the range of 3 to 7 kilometers. The two events, the boom and the fault activity, are geographically collocated but structurally separated by a few kilometers of crust. The question that this geography introduces is whether the collocation is meaningful. There is a body of geophysical literature, much of it from the past 3 decades, that examines the question of whether seismic activity at depth can produce atmospheric pressure waves that propagate to the surface. The proposed mechanism is called seismo-atmospheric coupling. It involves the rapid release of elastic energy at the fault interface, generating an acoustic emission that couples into the lower atmosphere through ground motion at the surface. The acoustic signature, when it emerges, can resemble a sonic boom but originates from below rather than above. The literature is not yet established as mainstream geophysics. The United States Geological Survey, in its public characterization of the May 28th event, has not invoked the seismo-atmospheric coupling mechanism. The agency's catalogue entry classifies the event as a sonic boom, which is, in the technical sense, an acoustic shock wave produced by something moving through the atmosphere at supersonic speed, with the shock front arriving at the surface from above. The seismo-atmospheric coupling hypothesis would propose a different mechanism, in which the shock front originates from below and brakes against the surface as it travels upward through the air. These two mechanisms are not the same. The standard sonic boom mechanism requires a supersonic source moving through the air. The seismo-atmospheric coupling mechanism requires a high-energy release at depth that couples into the atmosphere through surface motion. Distinguishing between them, in any particular event, requires close analysis of the waveform recorded by the seismic instruments. The waveform of a true atmospheric sonic boom looks different from the waveform of a seismo-atmospheric coupling event. The first arrives as an acoustic pressure wave that is propagated through the atmosphere. The second arrives as a complex signature that combines ground motion with delayed atmospheric coupling. The waveform analysis that produced the United States Geological Survey's classification of the May 28th event as a sonic boom indicates that the agency, based on the seismic data, concluded the event was atmospheric. The shock wave originated above, but the geographic co-location of the event with the active fault system below, on the timescale of a single afternoon, is the kind of coincidence that the seismo-atmospheric coupling literature would predict to occasionally happen when fault activity at depth happens to be paired with an atmospheric event above, and when the acoustic signatures arrive at the surface in a sequence that may or may not be causally connected. This is the point I want to be careful about. The data we have does not establish that the May 28th boom was caused by the underlying fault system. The waveform analysis points to an atmospheric source. NASA rules out a meteor. The conventional alternative is some form of supersonic atmospheric source, most likely an aircraft, which would put us back to the question of which aircraft was flying supersonically over central South Carolina at 24 minutes past 5 on the afternoon of May 28th. But the co-location is on the record. It is geographically suggestive. And the broader pattern of two active swarms producing seismicity along reactivating eastern Piedmont strands set against the backdrop of an unexplained sonic boom that the federal agencies have not yet attributed is the kind of coincidence that the rest of the country has noticed. The next part walks through the seismo-atmospheric coupling hypothesis in more detail, because it is one of the two readings that the data permits even after the conventional readings have been examined. And then we will come back to the central thread, which is the asymmetry of disclosure between the two events. Part 7. Seismo-atmospheric coupling. The geophysical literature on seismo-atmospheric coupling is, as I mentioned, not yet established as mainstream science. But it is real literature. It has been published in peer-reviewed journals over the course of the past 3 decades. It has been the subject of dissertations and research programs at major universities, and it offers, as a candidate explanation for the kind of unattributable atmospheric pressure event we are looking at in the May 28th case, a mechanism that the standard sonic boom framework does not provide. The basic physics is straightforward in principle, even if the details are technically demanding. When elastic energy is released at a fault interface, the release occurs in microseconds, far faster than any human-scale event. The fault surfaces, which have been locked under accumulated stress for years or centuries, slip suddenly, and the rocks on either side of the slip move past each other at velocities measured in meters per second over distances measured in meters. The energy released by this rapid motion propagates outward in all directions through the surrounding rock as seismic waves, which are what seismographs record. Most of the energy stays in the rock. Seismic waves travel efficiently through solid material, and the overwhelming majority of the elastic energy from a small to moderate earthquake remains in the subsurface, dissipating gradually as the waves propagate outward through the crust. But not all of the energy stays in the rock. Some fraction of the energy reaches the surface, where the ground motion couples into the atmosphere through the physical displacement of the surface itself. When the ground moves upward, it pushes the air above it. When the ground moves downward, it creates a pressure deficit. The result is an acoustic pressure wave generated at the surface, originating from below, propagating upward into the lower atmosphere. For most earthquakes, this surface coupling is too small to produce an audible signature. The ground motion is at frequencies too low for human hearing, and the energy in the resulting acoustic wave is too dispersed to produce any noticeable atmospheric effect. But under specific conditions, the coupling can be efficient enough, and the energy release can be concentrated enough, that the resulting acoustic wave can become audible at the surface as a low-frequency boom, sometimes described as a thump, sometimes described as a distant explosion, sometimes described as a roar. The conditions that maximize the efficiency of the coupling are roughly the following. First, the earthquake source must be at relatively shallow depth, typically in the upper few kilometers of the crust, where the elastic energy release is close enough to the surface that the ground motion is large rather than damped by the overlying rock. Second, the fault geometry must be oriented such that a significant component of the ground motion is vertical rather than purely horizontal. Vertical ground motion couples into the atmosphere more efficiently than horizontal motion. Third, the local crustal structure must transmit the seismic energy to the surface efficiently, without absorbing it in soft sediments or other low-rigidity materials. Fourth, the timing of the energy release must be sharp with a steep onset, so the resulting surface motion produces a strong acoustic impulse rather than a diffuse vibration. The active fault strands beneath the Lake Murray and Elgin swarm corridors are at shallow depths in the range of 3 to 7 kilometers. They are oriented along the structural grain of the Eastern Piedmont Fault system, which has both strike-slip and reverse fault components, meaning the motion has both horizontal and vertical components. The crustal structure of the South Carolina Piedmont is metamorphic, with relatively high rigidity, which transmits seismic energy efficiently, and the rate of seismicity in the broader corridor, while individually modest in magnitude, has been sustained at a level that suggests the local stress field is being continuously reloaded. The seismo-atmospheric coupling hypothesis would propose that, under the right combination of these conditions, the cumulative energy release from the swarm can occasionally produce surface ground motion sharp enough and large enough to generate an audible atmospheric signature. The signature would arrive at the surface from below, propagating upward into the air and then radiating outward in a pattern similar to a sonic boom, but with a different underlying physics. I want to be very clear about where this hypothesis sits in the current scientific consensus. It is not established. The United States Geological Survey has not invoked it for the May 28th event. The standard seismological interpretation of the catalogue entry is that the event was atmospheric in origin, with the shock wave arriving at the surface from above. The sonic boom event type designation reflects that interpretation. If the seismo-atmospheric coupling hypothesis were the agency's preferred reading, the designation would likely be different, or the catalogue entry would carry an additional notation referencing the underlying fault system. But the hypothesis is real literature. It has been examined in connection with other intraplate seismic events around the world, including events in Central Australia, in the Reelfoot Rift system of the central United States, and in the Charlevoix seismic zone of Quebec. In each of these cases, the question of whether some fraction of the observed atmospheric pressure events can be attributed to seismo-atmospheric coupling has been raised in the technical literature. The answers have been mixed, and the consensus is that the mechanism is not well established as a routine source of audible booms, but that it cannot be ruled out for individual events whose conventional attribution is otherwise weak. The May 28th event has a weak conventional attribution. NASA ruled out a meteor. Shaw ruled out its aircraft. McIntyre did not speak. The remaining conventional source is some other supersonic aircraft transiting the area, which is plausible but unconfirmed. The non-conventional sources include seismo-atmospheric coupling, undisclosed military testing, and other mechanisms that have not been publicly entertained. The seismo-atmospheric coupling hypothesis is one of several non-conventional candidate readings. The reason I am spending time on it is that the geographic collocation of the boom with the active swarm corridor is the kind of data point that the hypothesis would predict to occasionally produce. It does not establish the mechanism, but it does mean that any complete account of the May 28th event has to grapple with the geography. The boom occurred above an active fault system that has been producing record-breaking seismicity. The collocation is in the public record, and the next entry in the catalogue, whatever it turns out to be, will be the first piece of evidence that begins to distinguish between the conventional and the non-conventional readings. For the central thread of the video, the importance of the seismo-atmospheric coupling hypothesis is the following. It is a candidate reading of the South Carolina event that the data does not require but also does not rule out. It is one of several available readings, and the fact that the available readings include both conventional aircraft sources and non-conventional crustal sources is itself a measure of how much uncertainty remains in the federal record. The uncertainty is what keeps the catalogue entry open, and the catalogue entry being open is what links the May 28th event to today's Massachusetts event in the public imagination. even though the events themselves may be entirely independent in their underlying physics. There is one more piece of the seismo-atmospheric coupling discussion that is worth putting on the record before we move on, because it speaks to a deeper question about how much the public actually knows about what is happening beneath the surface of the continent we live on. The Eastern Piedmont Fault System is not the only intraplate fault system in the eastern United States that has, in recent decades, produced unexpected seismicity. The New Madrid seismic zone in the central Mississippi River Valley, the seismic zone responsible for the catastrophic 1811 and 1812 earthquakes that briefly reversed the flow of the Mississippi River, has been continuously monitored and has continued to produce small to moderate events throughout the modern instrumental period. The Charleston seismic zone in South Carolina, the source of the 1886 Charleston earthquake that killed more than 60 people and damaged buildings as far away as Boston, remains active in the formal sense and is the subject of ongoing United States Geological Survey hazard assessment. The Charlevoix seismic zone in Quebec, the Reelfoot Rift in northeastern Arkansas, the Wabash Valley seismic zone in southern Illinois and Indiana, the eastern Tennessee seismic zone running through the southern Appalachians, all of these are active intraplate features that continue to produce measurable seismic activity along ancient structural lines. The fact that the eastern interior of the North American continent is seismically active at all is, in the broader historical sense, a relatively recent realization. For most of the 20th century, the standard textbook framing of North American seismic hazard placed almost all of the active risk along the western plate boundary, with the eastern half of the continent characterized as effectively stable. The instrumental monitoring of the past 4 decades has revised that picture substantially. The eastern interior is not stable, it is loaded. The ancient fault systems that crisscross the Piedmont, the Appalachian foothills, the Mississippi embayment, and the Great Lakes region are all carrying accumulated stress, and the rate at which they are producing observable seismic activity is, in many cases, higher now than it was in the early instrumental record. Whether this represents a genuine increase in seismic activity, or whether it represents an increase in the sensitivity of the monitoring network that is now detecting events that would have been missed in the 1960s and 70s, is itself an open question in the structural geology community. The reason this matters for the May 28th boom is that the geographic location of the event with the Lake Murray swarm corridor is not a curiosity in isolation. It is a data point inside a much broader pattern of intraplate seismic activity that, across the eastern half of the continent, is being recorded at unprecedented rates. If the seismo-atmospheric coupling mechanism is producing audible booms at the surface of the Earth at some non-zero rate, the rate is going to scale with the underlying seismic activity. More earthquakes mean more opportunities for coupling. And if the eastern interior of the continent is currently producing more earthquakes than it has at any point in the instrumental record, the probability of seismo-atmospheric coupling events being heard at the surface is, in the same statistical sense, higher than it has been at any prior point. I want to be clear that this argument does not establish the mechanism. The mechanism is not established in the technical literature, but the broader pattern of intraplate seismic activity in the eastern United States is the kind of context in which the seismo-atmospheric coupling hypothesis becomes more relevant rather than less. The catalogue entry being open is consistent with the broader pattern. The geography is consistent with the broader pattern. The agency response, in which the United States Geological Survey has classified the event as a sonic boom, but has not invoked the coupling mechanism in its public characterization, is consistent with the agency's standard practice of not invoking mechanisms that are not yet established in the formal literature. The data is, in this sense, exactly where the broader pattern would predict it to be. Part 8. The hypersonic test hypothesis. If the bolide hypothesis fails for the South Carolina event, and if the seismo-atmospheric coupling hypothesis is not yet established as a routine source of audible booms, the remaining candidate explanation that fits both the felt footprint and the federal disclosure pattern is undisclosed military or aerospace test activity. This is the hypothesis that has, over the past 48 hours, received the most attention in the online discourse, and it is the one that the McIntyre silence has done the most to keep alive in the public conversation. The United States military has, over the past decade, been operating an active and largely unclassified hypersonic flight test program. The program is distributed across multiple defense entities and aerospace contractors, and it covers a range of vehicle types and operational profiles. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the United States Air Force Research Laboratory, and the United States Army Hypersonic and Conventional Strike Office all manage components of the program, often in partnership with private contractors, including Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Dynetics. The vehicles under test include the X-60 Hypersonic Flight Research Vehicle, the AGM-183 Air-Launched Rapid Response Weapon, the Common Hypersonic Glide Body, the Long-Range Hypersonic Weapon, and a series of related boost glide and air-breathing systems. The acoustic signatures these vehicles produce during flight test are, in general, distinguishable from conventional supersonic aircraft, but they fall within the same broad envelope as a large sonic boom. A hypersonic glide body, travelling at Mach 5 or above through the upper atmosphere, produces a pressure wave that arrives at the surface as a low-frequency, prolonged boom, sometimes described by witnesses as a rolling rumble lasting several seconds rather than a single sharp crack. The boom signature is the result of the vehicle's hypersonic flight envelope, which differs from a conventional supersonic aircraft in altitude, speed, and the geometry of the shock wave. But from the perspective of a witness on the ground, the acoustic signature can be similar enough to a conventional sonic boom that the two are not always distinguishable without instrumented analysis. The Department of Defense does not typically pre-announce hypersonic flight tests over the continental United States. The tests are conducted under operational secrecy, with airspace restrictions managed through Federal Aviation Administration coordination, but without public disclosure of the test schedule. The standard practice is for the test to occur, for any resulting public noise complaints to be processed through ordinary channels, and for the test program to acknowledge the event only after the fact, if at all. The pattern of disclosure is consistent with broader Department of Defense practice for sensitive flight test activities. If a hypersonic flight test had been the source of the May 28 South Carolina boom, the federal disclosure pattern would look approximately the way it does. NASA, which is not in the chain of command for military hypersonic testing, would be free to confirm a negative finding for the Meteor hypothesis. Shaw Air Force Base, which operates conventional supersonic-capable aircraft but is not directly involved in hypersonic test operations, would be free to confirm a negative finding for its own assets. McEntire Joint National Guard Base, which operates F-16 Fighting Falcon Block 52 aircraft and is the closest installation to the catalogued source point, would either have been operating routine training flights or might have been hosting transient operations from other commands, and in either case would not be expected to publicly characterize the airspace activity. The United States Geological Survey would, based on the seismic waveform analysis, log the event as a sonic boom event type and assign a unique catalog identifier, because the agency's classification is based on the physics of the pressure wave, not on its source. The catalog entry would sit open in the federal record, because the federal record does not include a mechanism for officially attributing a sonic boom event to an undisclosed military test. This pattern is not proof that a hypersonic test occurred. It is consistent with the pattern of disclosure that a hypersonic test would produce, but it is also consistent with other readings, including the possibility that some other supersonic aircraft was transiting the area on a routine basis and that the public attribution simply has not closed. The available data does not distinguish between these readings, but I want to be honest about one feature of the pattern that is worth noting. The Department of Defense's hypersonic flight test program has expanded substantially in recent years. The pace of testing has increased. The geographic distribution of testing has shifted, with some test corridors now extending over the southeastern United States and the western Atlantic, in addition to the traditional ranges over the Pacific. The frequency of public boom reports from the southeastern United States has, over the same period, increased. The South Carolina Swarm Corridor sits geographically between several active military installations, including Shaw, McEntire, Fort Liberty in North Carolina, Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in North Carolina, and the broader operational footprint of Air Combat Command and Air National Guard units across the southeast. This is the context in which the McEntire silence sits. The silence is consistent with routine non-disclosure. It is also consistent with the possibility that the airspace over central South Carolina at the relevant time was hosting activity that the base is not authorized to characterize publicly. The data does not tell us which reading is correct. But the broader pattern of expanded hypersonic testing in the southeastern United States, combined with the federal disclosure asymmetry on the May 28th event, has produced an inference that some segment of the public has drawn that something is being tested in the airspace over the southeastern United States, and that the public is being kept partially informed of when those tests occur. I am not making that inference. The data does not require it. But I am noting that the inference is being drawn, and that the structure of the federal disclosure pattern has done nothing to discourage it. The asymmetry of public engagement between NASA and Shore, on the one hand, and McIntyre on the other, has the effect of focusing public attention on the airspace activity question. Whether that focusing was intended or unintended by the agencies involved is itself a question the public record cannot resolve. For today's Massachusetts event, the hypersonic test hypothesis fits less well. The geostationary lightning mapper flash detection over the Atlantic east of Massachusetts is a specific piece of evidence that points away from a hypersonic vehicle and toward a bolide. A hypersonic glide body, travelling at Mach 5 or higher through the upper atmosphere, would not typically produce a flash detectable by the lightning mapper. The thermal signature of a hypersonic vehicle is in a different spectral range than the flash signature of a bolide breakup, and the lightning mapper is calibrated for visible light transients of the type that bolide entries produce. The Massachusetts flash in this reading is evidence that whatever happened over the Atlantic east of Boston this afternoon was an atmospheric meteor entry, not a hypersonic test event. The two events, then, may have different sources. The South Carolina event could be, under the available evidence, either a conventional supersonic aircraft, an undisclosed military test, or some combination of factors including possible seismo-atmospheric coupling. The Massachusetts event is, under the available evidence, most likely a bolide. The two events are temporally close. They are geographically along the same coast. But the underlying physics may be entirely independent. The temporal clustering may be a coincidence, or it may not, and that is what the next part is about. Before we leave the hypersonic test discussion behind, I want to put one more piece of context on the record, because it bears on how plausible the test hypothesis actually is. The expansion of the United States hypersonic flight test program over the past 3 years has produced a measurable uptick in the rate of unexplained boom reports across multiple regions of the continental United States. The phenomenon is sometimes referred to colloquially as the Seneca guns, named after a long-standing pattern of unexplained boom reports along the coast of the Carolinas that has been documented since at least the 19th century. The classical Seneca guns reports were attributed at various times to undersea methane releases, to atmospheric inversions transmitting distant thunder, to the collapse of submarine landslides, or to military aircraft offshore. The modern revival of similar boom reports, in places like central South Carolina and southeastern Virginia, and the eastern North Carolina coastal plain, has tracked the expansion of regional military test ranges and the introduction of new high-speed vehicle types into the operational inventory. The correlation does not establish causation, but it is the kind of correlation that, taken with the McIntyre silence and with the absence of a satellite flash detection for the May 28th event, has pushed a significant fraction of the online discourse toward the hypersonic interpretation rather than the bolide interpretation. Whether the discourse is correct is a separate question, but the discourse exists for a reason, and the reason is the pattern of unattributed booms along the southeastern coast over the past several years. Part 9. Propagation through a loaded atmosphere. There is a piece of the puzzle that I have been working around without putting it at the centre of the discussion, and it is the question of why both of these events produce such large felt footprints. A sonic boom that registers intensity 6 on the modified Mercalli scale, with felt reports across more than 100 miles of land, is not the kind of pressure wave that a typical small source can produce under typical atmospheric conditions. The footprint is at the upper end of the envelope for any conventional atmospheric acoustic propagation. And the question of why the propagation envelope has been so large over the past 48 hours is connected to a piece of meteorology that we have been talking about all week on this channel, but in a completely different context. The eastern United States is currently sitting underneath a strong upper-level trough pattern that, in the technical language of atmospheric science, is referred to as an omega block configuration. The block is a stable wave pattern in the upper troposphere that, when it sets up over a continent, can persist for days or weeks while the prevailing zonal flow flows around it rather than through it. The block has been the dominant feature of the eastern United States weather pattern for the past week. It has produced anomalous cold air advection from Canada into the northeast. It has driven the closed low-pressure system that yesterday's video covered, the coastal cyclone that was at this moment producing snow flurries in New England on May 30th, and high wind warnings on Cape Cod. It has organised the severe weather setup that is unfolding across the plains today, with an enhanced risk for severe thunderstorms over central Kansas, and it has shaped the vertical structure of the lower atmosphere across the entire eastern half of the continent in a way that, for acoustic propagation, matters more than the public discourse has noticed. The vertical structure of the lower atmosphere governs how sound waves propagate horizontally. Under standard conditions, a sound wave emitted at the surface or at low altitude travels outward in a roughly spherical pattern, with the energy spreading over an ever larger area and attenuating with distance. The intensity falls off rapidly. A loud boom at the source becomes a moderate rumble a few miles away, and an inaudible vibration at greater distances. This is the standard line of sight acoustic propagation that governs most everyday sound events. But the lower atmosphere is not always uniformly stratified. When a strong thermal inversion sets up at low altitude, with cold air near the surface and warmer air above, the inversion layer acts as an acoustic ceiling. Sound waves emitted at the surface, instead of escaping vertically into the upper atmosphere, reflect off the inversion layer and remain trapped in the lower layer. The trapped wave propagates laterally with much less attenuation than it would under standard conditions. The result is that a sound event at the surface, under inversion conditions, can be heard at much greater distances than the same event under non-inversion conditions. The current omega block configuration over the eastern United States has produced exactly this kind of thermal stratification. The cold air advection from Canada into the northeast has set up a sharp temperature gradient in the lower troposphere, with cold air near the surface and warmer air aloft, particularly across the corridor from the Appalachian foothills out to the Atlantic coast. The same temperature gradient extends, with regional variation, down through the Carolinas and into the southeastern United States. The lower atmosphere across the entire eastern seaboard for the past several days has been configured as an unusually efficient acoustic waveguide. This is the piece of context that I want to make sure lands clearly. A sound event of a given source intensity occurring in the current atmospheric configuration will produce a much larger felt footprint than the same source intensity would produce under typical conditions. The 100-mile felt footprint of the May 28th South Carolina boom and the comparable footprint of today's Massachusetts event are not by themselves evidence of an unusually energetic source. They are also consistent with a more modest source propagating through an unusually receptive atmosphere. What this means, in practical terms, is that the felt footprint of the events does not tell us by itself that we are dealing with sources at the extreme upper end of the energy envelope. A relatively modest bolide, a routine supersonic aircraft or any other atmospheric pressure source could under current conditions produce the kind of widespread felt response that the past 48 hours have generated. The atmospheric configuration is doing work that the source does not have to do. This connects back to the central thread of the video in a specific way. The fact that we are now sitting underneath a stratified atmosphere that amplifies acoustic propagation means that any atmospheric pressure source occurring within this footprint, whether meteoric, military or otherwise, will produce a public response disproportionate to the source itself. The current atmospheric configuration is, in effect, a magnifier for ground-level public attention. Events that would have been small, local stories under standard conditions are becoming 100-mile public events under current conditions. The frequency of public boom reports across the eastern United States over the past week has been elevated, and the propagation envelope is part of the reason. This does not change the central question. The question is still about the asymmetry of disclosure between the South Carolina event and the Massachusetts event. The propagation envelope explains why both events produced large felt footprints. It does not explain why one was attributed quickly and the other was not. The source question and the propagation question are separate. The propagation question tells us why we are hearing about both events on a national scale rather than as local curiosities. The source question is what the federal catalogue will eventually answer when it answers, and the answer it gives, when it gives one, will tell us something about the system that is doing the answering. Part 10. The Asymmetry of Disclosure. I want to spend this part going back to the central question of the video, now that we have walked through the candidate physical explanations, the federal disclosure pattern, the geographic collocation with the South Carolina swarm corridor, and the role of the current atmospheric configuration in amplifying the felt footprint of both events. The question, restated, is the following. 2 large, unexplained sonic booms have occurred along the United States East Coast in 48 hours. One has been attributed quickly and convincingly to a bolide. The other has been logged in the federal catalogue with conventional sources publicly ruled out and no positive attribution. What does the asymmetry of disclosure tell us? The first thing it tells us is that the federal infrastructure for attributing atmospheric pressure events is not a single system. It is a distributed set of agencies, each with a different operational mandate, each authorized to speak to a specific slice of the question. NASA can speak to meteoric sources because NASA operates the detection network for objects entering the atmosphere from space. The Air Force can speak to its own aircraft because the Air Force operates the flight logs for its own assets. The National Guard can speak to its own training operations, although the public affairs norms for Air National Guard units are different from the norms for regular Air Force installations, and the standard practice is not to publicly characterize routine training flights in real time. The United States Geological Survey can speak to the seismic waveform analysis, because the agency operates the instruments that record the ground motion. Each agency contributes a piece of the public picture. The picture is complete only when the pieces line up. For today's Massachusetts event, the pieces lined up quickly. The geostationary lightning mapper produced a satellite detection that fit the bolide signature. NASA and the regional meteorological community converged on the Meteor attribution within 90 minutes. The American Meteor Society's public fireball reporting queue began collecting eyewitness submissions that, when consolidated, will likely confirm the trajectory. The pieces of the federal picture plus the public reporting network are all pointing in the same direction. The event has a coherent attribution, and the catalogue entry, when it is finalized, will most likely close with a confirmed Meteor designation. For the May 28th South Carolina event, the pieces did not line up. NASA reported a negative finding for the Meteor hypothesis. Shaw reported a negative finding for its own aircraft. McIntyre did not report. The United States Geological Survey logged the event as a sonic boom event type with a unique catalogue identifier. The pieces of the federal picture are partial. They have ruled out the most common conventional sources without ruling in any specific alternative. The catalogue entry remains open in the sense that the event type is recorded but the source attribution is not, and the entry will only close when additional information becomes available. The asymmetry between the two attribution patterns, occurring on the same coast within 48 hours, is not by itself evidence that anything unusual is happening at the level of the events themselves. The asymmetry is, in the most defensible reading, simply a reflection of the evidence available for each event. The Massachusetts event has satellite evidence that points cleanly toward a bolide. The South Carolina event does not have equivalent satellite evidence, and the conventional alternatives have been ruled out without a clear replacement. The two events have different evidence profiles, and the attribution speed has scaled accordingly. But the asymmetry is also a reflection of something deeper about the federal infrastructure itself. The system can move quickly when the evidence is good. It can also produce a catalogue entry, rule out the obvious sources, and then stop, leaving the question publicly unresolved. Both of these are normal operating modes of the system. The catalogue is not designed to force a final attribution within a fixed time window. It is designed to record what is known, to flag what is not known, and to leave the entry open until further information either closes it or moves it into a different category. What the public is now watching, in real time, is the operation of this system across two events, with very different evidence profiles. The system is performing as it is designed to perform. The Massachusetts event is being attributed quickly because the evidence allows it. The South Carolina event is being held open because the evidence does not yet support a confident attribution. The asymmetry is, in the formal sense, a feature of the system, not a malfunction. But this is also why the South Carolina event has, over the past 48 hours, generated as much public discussion as it has. The catalogue entry is, in the formal language of the federal record, an open question. Open questions in federal databases tend to attract attention. They become the focus of online discussion, of community theorizing, of independent investigation by interested parties. The fact that the entry is open is what keeps the question alive, even after the conventional sources have been publicly examined, and the question is going to stay alive, in some form, until the catalogue entry either closes with a positive attribution or fades into the background as the focus shifts to other events. The federal record will eventually do one or the other. The question is which. Part 11. What the next entry will tell us. I want to spend this part on the question of what we should expect next, because the central narrative of this video has been about two events that occurred in the past, and about what their juxtaposition tells us about the current state of federal disclosure for atmospheric pressure phenomena. But the more interesting question is what the next entry in the catalogue is going to tell us, and how soon we are going to see it. There are, broadly, three categories of next entry that could close or extend the current pattern. The first category is a confirmed attribution for the May 28th South Carolina event. This would take the form of a public statement from one of the federal agencies, identifying the source of the boom and updating the catalogue entry to include the source designation. The candidates for the source, given the evidence ruled out so far, are limited. The remaining conventional candidates include some other Air Force aircraft transiting the area on routine operations, with the public attribution simply lagging the operational record. The non-conventional candidates include undisclosed military test activity, which would resolve through a Department of Defense statement, or a delayed identification of an extremely small bolide that initially escaped the satellite detection chain, but was subsequently identified through ground-based evidence. Either of these resolutions would close the catalogue entry with a specific source designation, and would in the process tell us something about which kinds of events the federal infrastructure is willing to publicly identify after the fact. The second category is an additional event of similar character. If a third unexplained boom were to occur on the eastern seaboard within the next several days or weeks, with a similar federal disclosure pattern, the temporal clustering would shift from being a two-event coincidence to being a multi-event pattern. Multi-event patterns are harder to dismiss as coincidence, and they tend to attract a different level of agency engagement. The United States Geological Survey, if it began to see multiple sonic boom event-type entries clustering on the eastern seaboard in a short period, would likely shift from individual event analysis to pattern analysis and might issue a public statement characterizing the cluster. The other federal agencies would likely follow with their own public characterizations, either ruling in or ruling out their respective conventional sources for the broader pattern. The third category is a quiet fade. If no additional events occur and no public attribution closes the May 28th entry, within the next several weeks, the catalogue entry will, in effect, settle into the federal record as an unattributed event. This is not unusual in the broader catalogue history. There are other sonic boom event-type entries in the federal record that have remained without a confirmed source attribution. They sit in the database as part of the historical record, available for future analysis, but not actively pursued by any agency's current investigations. If the May 28th event follows this trajectory, it will, over time, become one more entry in the catalogue with an event type but without a source. The public attention will move on to other things, and the question of what produced the May 28th boom will remain open in the formal record without ever being closed. I do not have a confident prediction about which of these three categories the current case will fall into. Each is plausible. The evidence does not strongly favour one over the others. What I will say is that the first few days after a federally catalogued event are the most likely window for additional public statements from the relevant agencies, and as we are now in those first few days, the chance of new public information remains elevated. After approximately 1 week, the rate of new agency statements typically drops sharply, and the entry begins its transition toward whichever of the three trajectories it will ultimately follow. For today's Massachusetts event, the trajectory is, with high confidence, going to be the first category. The geostationary lightning mapper flash detection has already generated the public attribution. The American Meteor Society process will, almost certainly, finalize an event identifier within the next few days. Ground-based searches for fragments may or may not be successful, but the absence of recovered material will not, given the strength of the satellite evidence, prevent the case from being closed with a Meteor designation. The Massachusetts event is on a trajectory to be a closed case within a week, probably sooner. The South Carolina event is on a more uncertain trajectory. The federal disclosure pattern has already produced public negative findings from NASA and Shore, but it has not produced a positive attribution. The next public statement, if there is one, will most likely come from either the Department of Defense, addressing the question of military airspace activity, or from the United States Geological Survey, addressing the question of whether the seismic waveform analysis is consistent with any non-standard source mechanism. Either statement would move the case toward a closer attribution. The absence of either statement over the coming days would keep the entry open. The thing I find most interesting about the current pattern is the role of public attention in shaping the trajectory. The federal catalogue is, in the strictest operational sense, indifferent to public attention. The agencies that maintain it are responsible to their congressional oversight and to their internal scientific and operational missions, not to the news cycle. But the public attention does affect the timing of agency statements. When an event becomes a subject of national discussion, the agencies that have something to say tend to say it more quickly than they would for an event that remains a local curiosity. The South Carolina event, having now been linked in the public imagination to today's Massachusetts event, is operating in a different attention environment than it would have been if it had remained an isolated regional story. Whether the heightened attention will accelerate a public attribution for the South Carolina event, or whether the agencies will continue with their current pattern of partial disclosure, is itself one of the things we're about to find out. There is a piece of the broader pattern that I want to put on the record before we move to the closing section, because it speaks to how the public should think about what comes next. In the days following any high-attention atmospheric event, the rate of public boom reports across the surrounding region tends to spike. This is partially the result of genuinely elevated event frequency, and partially the result of what behavioral scientists call attentional contagion. Once a population has been primed to pay attention to atmospheric anomalies, they begin reporting events that would, under normal conditions, have been dismissed as routine ambient noise. The result is that, in the week following a federally catalogued sonic boom event, the public reporting volume to both the United States Geological Survey and the American Meteor Society reliably increases, with most of the increase resolving on follow-up into mundane events like distant thunder, sonic booms from supersonic aircraft on standard operational routes, and quarry blasts or construction activity that would not normally be flagged. The agencies have to filter through the increased volume to identify the genuine signal events, and the filtering process can take days or weeks. This means that, in the immediate aftermath of today's Massachusetts event, the federal agencies should expect to receive an elevated volume of boom reports from across the eastern seaboard. Most of these reports will resolve into routine sources, but the fraction that do not resolve, the fraction that produce new catalogue entries with sonic boom event type designations, will be the dataset against which the May 28th and May 30th events are eventually compared. If the rate of unexplained boom reports drops back to baseline within a week, the current cluster will resolve as a two-event coincidence. If the rate stays elevated, with additional unattributed events being added to the catalogue, the cluster will resolve into a longer-running phenomenon that the agencies will have to publicly characterise. The public attention environment over the next several days is therefore going to be one of the more important factors shaping how the May 28th and May 30th events are eventually classified in the federal record. Public attention drives the volume of reports. The volume of reports drives the rate at which the agencies have to engage. And the rate of agency engagement in the asymmetric pattern we have been examining drives the speed of attribution. The system is recursive. The public watches the agencies, and the agencies, in their own time and on their own schedule, watch the public response to their disclosures. The next few days will tell us which of the two events is going to settle into the federal record as a closed case, and which is going to remain an open question. Part 12. 2 booms, 1 coast, 48 hours. I want to close this video by going back to the structure of the central question and being honest about what we have and have not figured out over the past 2 hours. What we have. We have 2 catalogued events of similar physical character, occurring along the same 800-mile stretch of coastline within a 48-hour window. We have one event with a strong public attribution to a bolide, supported by satellite flash detection, immediate professional meteorological consensus, and a rapidly accumulating set of eyewitness reports. We have a second event with no public attribution, with conventional sources publicly ruled out by NASA and by Shaw Air Force Base, and with the geographically closest military installation, McEntire Joint National Guard Base, choosing not to publicly characterize its operations during the relevant time window. We have a federal catalogue that records both events using the sonic boom event type designation, indicating that the underlying physics is similar even if the sources may be different. We have a current atmospheric configuration that, due to the active omega block weather pattern, is propagating sound at unusually long distances, which has the effect of magnifying the public response to any atmospheric pressure source in the region. And we have an active intraplate earthquake swarm corridor in central South Carolina sitting directly beneath the catalogue point of the May 28th event, which has been producing record-breaking shallow seismicity since December of 2021, and which the geophysical literature would not entirely exclude as a contributing factor to the May 28th boom, even though the standard interpretation places the source in the atmosphere. What we do not have. We do not have a confirmed source attribution for the May 28th event. We do not have a recovered fragment from the May 30th event, although the absence of recovered material is not, given the satellite evidence, a strong objection to the bolide attribution. We do not have a public statement from the Department of Defense addressing the question of whether the airspace over central South Carolina was hosting any non-public flight activity at the relevant time. We do not have a confirmed link between the two events, in the sense that no federal agency has publicly characterized them as related, and in the formal sense the two entries in the catalogue are independent. And we do not have a clear answer to the central question of what produced the May 28th pressure wave. The honest reading of the data is that the two events have different evidence profiles and may have different sources. The Massachusetts event is most likely a bolide. The South Carolina event is genuinely unexplained, in the formal sense that the federal record contains an entry without a source designation. The temporal proximity of the two events is, on the available data, most likely a coincidence, although the data does not rule out the possibility of a connection that is currently invisible in the public record. The asymmetry of disclosure between the two events is, in the most defensible reading, a reflection of the asymmetry of evidence rather than a reflection of any agency choice about what to disclose. The system is performing as it is designed to perform, but I want to be clear about the broader point. The fact that the federal infrastructure can attribute one event in 90 minutes and not attribute another event in 48 hours is itself a piece of information about the limits of public attribution. It tells us that the system has a high bar for closure, and that when the evidence does not clear the bar, the system does not invent an attribution to satisfy public attention. The catalogue entry stays open. The question stays alive. The public record acknowledges what is known and what is not known, and it does so in a form that allows the next data point to extend the record without erasing the gap. This is, in its own way, a sign that the system is working. The catalogue is not a propaganda instrument. It is a scientific and operational record, and it is structured to preserve the integrity of what is known by being explicit about what is not. The May 28th event being open in the catalogue is not, by itself, evidence of any specific theory about its source. It is evidence that the federal record is, in this case, accurately representing the current state of public attribution. What the rest of us are going to have to live with for some period of time is the open question. The May 28th boom may eventually be attributed. It may not. The May 30th boom may be confirmed as bolide. It almost certainly will be. The two events may turn out to be entirely independent, with the temporal clustering being the kind of coincidence that the base rate of unusual atmospheric events occasionally produces, or they may turn out in some way that the public record does not currently allow us to see, to be related. The catalogue will tell us in its own time what the next entry says. In the meantime, what I want you to take away from this video is the following. The skies above the eastern seaboard of the United States are being watched by federal instruments, by professional meteorologists, by an active public reporting network, and by all of us paying attention from below. The watching is producing a public record. The record is, in this case, complete enough to attribute one event with high confidence, and incomplete enough to leave another event unattributed. The two facts are not in tension. They are the two operating modes of a system that is doing its job. What we are watching, in the most accurate framing, is not a mystery being concealed from us. It is a record being assembled in real time, with the gaps in the record being honestly acknowledged. The honest gap is the most important part of the record. It is what tells us where the next entry needs to land, and the next entry, whenever it comes and whatever it says, will be the moment when the open question either closes or extends into the next chapter. Until then, we are left with what we have. 2 booms, 2 states, 48 hours, 1 coast, and a federal record that is doing its best to tell us, as carefully as it can, what it knows and what it does not. The asymmetry of disclosure is not the source of the mystery. It is the structure of the record. And the record, in this case, is exactly as complete as the evidence allows, no more and no less. The next time the catalogue updates, we will know which of the available readings is the one the federal infrastructure is willing to put its name on, and the public record will be that much more complete than it is right now. Until then, the question sits open, the catalogue entry is live, and the eastern seaboard is watching for the next data point, whatever it turns out to be. I want to end with one last observation, because it is the kind of thing that, when you step back from the technical details, tells you something about what we are actually living through. We live in an era when the federal infrastructure for monitoring the sky above us is more capable than at any previous moment in human history. Satellites in geosynchronous orbit watch every patch of the Western Hemisphere 500 times per second. Ground-based seismic networks record pressure waves with millisecond precision across the entire continental United States. Public reporting systems collect eyewitness accounts within minutes of any event of public significance. The American Meteor Society's pending Fireball reports queue receives submissions from members of the public who are now, themselves, part of the detection network. The catalogue entries in the United States Geological Survey database are public, searchable, and updated in close to real time. The information environment around any atmospheric event is, by historical standards, extraordinarily dense, and yet, with all of this infrastructure in place, an event can still occur 2 days ago, 800 miles to our south, that the system has not been able to publicly attribute. The event is not hidden. The catalogue records it. The agencies have engaged with the question, the conventional sources have been examined, and the answer is still, as of right now, not in the public record. This is the texture of the world we are actually living in. The monitoring is dense, the public record is honest. And the gap between what the system can see and what the system can publicly attribute is, in this particular case, exactly the size of the open question we are looking at. Whatever lands in the catalogue next is going to be one more piece of the picture. The picture is not complete. It may never be complete in the way that public attention sometimes hopes for, with a clean attribution and a closed case file. The federal record is more honest than that. It will tell us what it knows, it will leave open what it does not know, and the next data point, whenever and wherever it arrives, will be the next entry in a record that is still being written by an infrastructure that watches the sky on our behalf, and by all of us watching the infrastructure to see what it eventually has to say. That is the story, as of the moment I am recording this. It is not the whole story. It is the part of the story we can tell from inside the public record on May 30th, 2026. The rest of it is on its way, and when it arrives, we will be here, watching, and telling you what the next entry says.